So I'm Sarah Aronson. I'm with Montana Public Radio, host of The Right Question. Thanks to the Missoula Public Library and the Montana Book Festival for having us here. Traditionally, this is the home of the Salish and Blackfeet people, and we're grateful to be here. And I am honored to introduce our guest today. So, starting on my far left is Desiree Funston. She studied creative writing at the University of Montana and library science at the University of Washington. She's a reference librarian at Missoula Public Library by day, and I didn't know this about you. You're a farmer in Stevensville on nights and weekends.
It's true.
What kind of farm animals?
Well, a few chickens, but it's hops mostly is what we do. We grow hops.
That's the best kind of farm animal.
It really is.
Next to Desiree is the beloved Robert Stubblefield, who was the Grizz Professor of the Week just a few weeks ago. You saw him throw a few passes. He's the faculty advisor for The Oval, which is the undergraduate literary magazine at the University of Montana, where he also teaches fiction and composition. His stories and essays have appeared in Dreamers and Desperados, Contemporary Fiction of the American West, High Desert Journal, Basalt, Open Spaces, Clackamas and Hayden's Ferry Literary Review, and among others. He's the recipient of several faculty awards. They just keep growing. I think he's listed as like one of the favorite professors on ratemyprofessor.com. And he's also responsible for many moments of good fortune in my life, including having this job with Montana Public Radio. Megan Stark, with the Harry Potter glasses, I love them so much, is a librarian at the University of Montana. She coordinates the undergraduate library experience and has a particular interest in how reading shapes learning. And last but not least, we have Kim Anderson, is the Director of Programs and Grants for Humanities Montana. She returned to her hometown of Missoula in 1989 and spent the next 11 years caring for her two children and working out of a home office, both as a freelance writer and editor and the executive director of several nonprofit arts organizations. Before returning to Missoula, she worked in New York City as the editor for an international business newspaper, the Journal of Commerce, an associate editor for a national magazine, Quest, an associate editor at Arbor House Publishing, a division of the Hearst Corporation, and as a subsidiary rights agent for the literary agency Lesher and Lesher Latitude. And as a freelance writer of articles, essays, fiction, and poetry, which have appeared in publications including the New York Times, the Journal of Commerce, Red Book, Ladies' Home Journal, Horizon, the Financial Times, Quest, and others. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is not a grand jury indictment. No one is on the stand about these picks. We're here to have a lively discussion about what it means to have beloved literature in Montana as we approach this voting deadline for Montana's best loved book, novel in specific. The last thing I want to say is that there are always politics involved in list making. As you can see looking at the panel, it's not very diverse. So I want to acknowledge that the voices aren't always represented, and we will get to some of that as we look into the questions. So my first question to the panelists is, how did you go about making the selections for the list? What were the criteria and considerations which influenced your picks? And you can go in any order you like.
Someone who is more organized than I was about it should go first.
I mean, I guess I really found that I started to track backwards to, I mean, I'm from Montana, and I really started to reflect back on the literature that was important to me when I was young. And so I think some of the choices that I ended up leaning heavily on demonstrated sort of a connection to my childhood, which is why I was actively promoting YA literature on the list. But also I think that those kinds of voices and the kinds of themes that would influence a Montana childhood were well captured in the books.
Well, I guess I came here from Oregon to study in the MFA program, and initially the titles that came to mind were kind of influenced by what Megan said. They were the books and the writers that drew me here, and you know, that wasn't a long list, but I discovered a much longer list when I got here, and perhaps a more diverse list than I would have anticipated. And then there were titles that, although they might not have been among my favorite, novels. I thought they were influential in ways that were deserving of a place on this top 20 list.
Many of my selections were those Montana canon books, the books that we think about when we think about Montana literature. But I also was privileged to serve on the Montana Book Award Committee for 3 years, from 2014 until 16. So a number of my selections are more contemporary novels that I was exposed to during my time on that committee.
And I grew up in Missoula, but I had a real abhorrence for Western literature until I moved back to Montana after being on the East Coast for about 15 years. And then was lucky enough to get the job of directing the book festival for its first 15 years. And so I was dealing with a lot of Western literature, and I realized the huge gaps in my knowledge and how really wrong I had been about that, as well as so many, many other things when I was 14 and 15. So the great experience of working with contemporary writers over those 15 years was one thing I brought to it, and thinking about some of the great moments that book festivals past that really drew huge crowds and were important for people. Also, Humanities Montana has run a program under various names and guises for about 40 years, which sponsors book clubs all over the state. And so at one point, my office was lined with book kits, and a very high portion of those were Montana literature. And so I knew from my almost 20 years at Humanities Montana which books people requested over and over and over. And I'm sure, Desiree, that came into some of it for you. So some of the picks were, like Robert said, maybe not my literary favorites, but were books that I knew resonated hugely with people in the state, and so they had to be on the list. And finally, when I was trying to pare down, I wanted to be as aware as I could of keeping as equal a gender balance on the list as possible, because I think that there is a huge misconception that Western literature is male, that the Western voice is a male voice. And so I was anxious to try to adjust that a little bit.
So I want to get into the nitty gritty, because when we had a planning meeting for this panel, immediately there was high emotion around, like, why is that on the list and why didn't this make the list? And so I just want to throw this ball of this can of worms to you guys. And what surprised you in terms of the books that didn't make the cut, that were your personal favorites, that were close to your heart, or ones that shocked you that were on the list?
Well, at the risk of embarrassing myself, I will share a story and answer your question. So I'm just making sure that wasn't Pete Fromm walking in, because he's who I'm going to talk about here. So when I was an 8th grader at North Middle School in Great Falls, Pete Fromm came to my class, to my English class, and he taught a unit on creative writing. And I don't remember now if he was there for a day or a week or the best month of my life. I really don't remember now, but it was fantastic. And so he spoke with our class about craft, and he gave us some tips on how to write, as much as you can teach craft to 12-year-olds. And then he shared some of his own work. And then the class each of us were supposed to write our own story. So, of course, some of Pete's fiction that he shared a story about baseball, okay? Well, I was so impressed with Pete and with his writing that I immediately plagiarized his work. And he was incredibly, incredibly kind and generous about the whole thing. In his written response to my story, he said, if you want to write about baseball, you probably ought to learn something about baseball. So I've been watching baseball ever since. But anyway, my personal list included several of Pete's works. I enjoy his fiction, but I think he really shines in memoir. So even though we sort of weren't supposed to include memoir in our list, I did. I had Indian Creek Chronicles and Names of the Stars both. I was very sad that his memoirs didn't end up on the final list.
Yeah.
Well, to follow up a little bit on what Desiree said, I think initially writers came to mind as much as individual titles, and then I thought, okay, I'll narrow it down to my favorite titles in their work. But as you mentioned, one of the criterions first was novels, and some of my favorite writers from Montana are probably not best known in the novel genre. And two writers who come to mind are Dorothy Johnson, who I think is very influential and kind of maybe underread a little bit now. And then, of course, Judy Blunt's Breaking Clean, which is a seminal book in Montana literature. And somebody else for me that I really hope to see on the list was Tom McGuane, but McGuane's known primarily now for short stories as of late, and maybe not as well known, although he has some very strong novels.
I think that's a good point. I had the same impulse to recognize maybe authors more than individual works. And so, clearly Montana poets, I was thinking, well, how could I get Richard Hugo onto this list? What would I need to do to manage that? But I think some of the writers that I wanted to see on the list were Mary Clearman Blue. All But the Waltz is a book that I think is really, really powerful. And then, authors like David Small, David Long. And so, trying to get that kind of short story, recognition into the list, I think was something that I was struggling with too.
Yeah, I put Death and the Good Life on my list. Richard Hugo's one mystery novel. It's a horrible mystery, but it's a charming book in so many ways. And and like you, I was desperate to get Hugo on the list because I think he has such a huge impact, especially in Western Montana. I went to the trouble of printing out my original list and highlighting mine that got on the final list, and I feel like I did pretty good. I had I have 14 out of 20, but I was sad. The Last Crossing, Guy Vanderhaeg, I think a totally underappreciated novel. Power of the Dog, Thomas Savage. Really surprised that didn't make it. Kittredge is another example of a writer who is hugely influential, I think, in Western literature. And I love his novel, The Willowfield, so that was on my list. Dorothy Johnson, absolutely. Red Harvest. Just because it's the Butte novel, that's so cool, and then other things. Dee McNamara and Claire Davis were two novelists that I've had. I felt a little bit like the more urban voice is not on this list, and there is some urban Montana literature.
I think the time is now to bring up Doig. Because his presence, he has 3 spots in a list of 20, and one of them is memoir. And so how did this happen? Where do we stand on Ivan Doig?
I guess my favorite title by Doig is This House of Sky, although I don't believe it was on my list because of, like I said, initially we were considering novels, but I mean, to a lot of people, he's kind of the voice of that era of Montana, and he has a lot of readers, and his proponents are passionate, as Barbara could attest to the crowds at readings and at the book festival in past years when he's appeared.
I guess if I were to push sort of beyond just the personal, because there are 3 judges who are not present, so we can blame everything on them, clearly.
Oh, yeah.
But just a sense of why does Doig reign so strongly in Montana, this notion of Montana Western literature? What's the affection about?
You know, I would just, my own theory is, and while I can appreciate the power of Doig's writing, especially stylistically, I think he's not one of my favorite Western writers, and but I think that the reason he shows up 3 times on this list and that he's so emblematic for so many people of the West is this issue that any Western literature, of course, talks about a lot of nostalgia, of the sense of loss of a certain kind of way of life. And I think Doig's work really taps into that. A clearer, more vivid, simpler time when things were hard, but people were good, and, you know. So that's my theory.
Yeah.
Well, I'll pose this question to my fellow panelists, but do you think the list is weighted a little heavily toward the stories that tell us what we want to believe about ourselves? And I mean, there's some hard stories on here, too. I mean, I think, you know, Fool's Crow.
Perma Red.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perma Red.
How would you answer that?
I posed the question.
I
Do you
think
feel
so.
like those titles tell us, as you said, the, you know, overcoming difficulty in a simpler sepia-toned time and, you know, well-intentioned people?
And I actually, this morning, I kind of went down the bookmark and started putting the kind of the eras or dates when each of these are set. And it's definitely, there's a heavy weight towards turn of the century, and I'm not talking about turn of the 21st century, you know, or 20s, 30s. So, and I think, you know, the more contemporary stories on this list are also the more difficult, not more difficult, they're also the more disturbing often and grimmer, maybe. What do you think?
No, I think that's a good observation, and I think it's a smart question to pose. Of course, then, you know, you would have to start asking questions about what Montana means to all of us, and if we all have the same shared experience. Because I think that authors like Doig imply, in some way, that there is a shared experience or a shared understanding of what Montana means. But in thinking back, Sarah, to your original question, I think that one of the things about Doig's work that is particularly interesting is just the romance with landscape. And that's something that I think is so distinct in his writing, and something that, whether we agree with it or not, it's so dominant in Montana literature, literary culture, this relationship to place. And certainly his descriptions are more, you know, these fanciful capturing of sort of smaller rural towns that a lot of people probably can relate to. But there's something more sweeping about the way in which he captures the landscape that I think does, in a lot of ways, speak to many people who would be drawn to Montana literature. So I think that's something that I think about with him as well.
Well, it's kind of interesting that he left Montana at a fairly young age, and to my
Yeah.
knowledge, never returned to live full-time, spent, you know,
Yeah.
most of his life in Seattle after he was an adult.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that speaks to your point about how it's nostalgia based. I mean, they're trying to recast this sort of his own experience, because his later life experiences would have been shaped by other locations, other landscapes. Yeah.
This has me thinking just about your experiences as writers, as librarians. What's your, how do you experience Montana regionalism in your life now? Like when you write or when you are drawn towards books, where do you go?
That's such a good question.
Like, Robert, are you still writing about fly fishing on streams under golden, not dusk?
Not so much. Well, you think about some of the books that that show up on here that, well, kind of contradict that story. There's a river runs through it, which is an important book in Montana. But then we also have Canada by Richard Ford, which tells a different story. But the book of short stories that I really had trouble keeping off my list was Rock Springs by Richard Ford, which tells, I think, from what readers have told me who grew up here, an accurate story, but a different story. And I think, that's something that Kim and Megan alluded to. There are a lot of Montana stories. There isn't the Montana story, although This House of Sky is an archetypal Montana story, but so is Fool's Crow.
Yeah, I'm glad you meant. For me, I think the richness of Native American literature is so important to me right now as a reader, and so I can't imagine trying to even begin to participate in Montana culture or literature without reading some of our amazing Native American authors. And in fact, one of my concerns about the national list is the absence of that voice. I mean, that's just an astonishing oversight. I mean, I don't even know what to call it. I find it so disturbing. Books like Perma Red that are so potent and so beautifully, that book just shines. And so I think for me, that's a really important influence in my reading right now.
I think that's a great point, Megan, that you made about the Great American Read list, the broader nationwide list. It does not include Native voices. There's a lot of diversity on that list, but that is a voice that just is not there. Getting back to Sarah's question, from a public librarian standpoint, the Montana story is an easy sell. When people come to the desk and say, I need something to read, even if I don't know anything about the person standing in front of me, I can recommend some of this stuff on the list confidently and know that people are going to, they might not love it, but they're going to enjoy it, and they're going to get something out of these books that are on this list and on the rest of the Montana literature canon more broadly.
And I wonder if we're predisposed to be slightly critical of the list and defensive of our own choices, when one thing that we can celebrate is that we're able to have this discussion and even argument, and that it's difficult to narrow it down to 20 novels, because in a state with the population that Montana has historically had, I would say that we're punching above our weight with this list, regardless of how we could quibble with what is or isn't on it.
That's absolutely true. When I go to represent the Center for the Book to the national meeting, which is in D.C., and I'm talking to people from the Midwest or there aren't a lot of states where we all came in with 25 names that are all nationally published, well regarded and known nationally titles, and they were all different lists, and we had a lot of, there was a lot of heartbreak in cutting things. So we have a wealth that a lot of parts of the country don't have, and so that's huge for me. And as someone who, although I was raised in Montana, I have really no rural experience at all. There are things on this list that represent more of my Montana too. but the flip side of that is, again, and Desiree probably sees this too, the things that across the state really resonate with people are the rural books.
Yeah, a book I would have loved to seen on here and had on my list is Go by Go by John
Right.
Jackson, which is
Yeah.
a Butte novel and a very urban political novel. Probably not one of John's best known books, but a great read.
I love this tension between a sense of tradition and that we have this wealth and this sort of wellspring of literature, and also this sense that we have to, like, out of my cold dead hands, right? Like somehow release the grip on and move forward. And so I'm thinking, Megan, about some of your picks, you know, some of the contemporary, some of the YA stuff, you know, the Miseducation of Cameron Post, Smith Henderson's work, you know, 4th of July Creek is where, like, if we're forward looking, what is the momentum about?
Yeah, I was when you were saying that, Robert, I was just thinking how, like Hattie Big Sky and Cameron Post. I mean, what an interesting sort of counterbalance those two characters in their portrayal of the kind of young women that might characterize Montana literature. And I'm thrilled that the voices of Montana writers and Montana characters are becoming increasingly diverse. And I haven't, is the film out yet, The Miseducation of Cameron Post? I don't know if it's been, I haven't seen it. I'll be really curious to see what happens in that translation to film, particularly because much of the tension in Montana literature does revolve around place and land. And so is that meaningful in the film, and is that going to be an important theme that's carried forward, or maybe that's an element that won't characterize some of the more modern literature that comes out? I'll be really curious to see. But I thought that as I was putting my list together, I was really thinking about the young adults, I mean the YA folks in our state, and sort of what their experience of the state will be, and the voices that are capturing their experience, and how different, just from my upbringing, that will be.
Hey, last week, the episode of the Right Question aired with Maxim Laskatov, and he presents this really different vision of the West. And tonight it's Erin Saldine who presents yet another version of the West, and hers, in some ways, involves kind of a bit more of location and place-based. But I'm really aware of a rise in tension, tension around class issues, tension around industry and tourism. I'm just thinking about what are the other tensions or themes even that are on the list or that we see going forward.
Yeah, I do think we're seeing more of that kind of, some of the more contemporary issues that, I think we started seeing it in McGuane stories a good 15, 20 years ago, this kind of, there are realtors in Montana. There are, there are a lot of realtors in Montana. And certainly Smith Henderson's novel, which is super tough. Even I think, those sorts of tensions we see in Winter in the Blood.
Yes.
We see them in a lot of books that came out. We see them in Perma Red, books that came out 20 years ago, 30 years ago. They just don't have, I think, the kind of aura that some other Western literature has around it. But I think they've always been there. I think those sorts of class and economic issues have always been a part of it.
I love that you said that, because I was just thinking how Letters from Yellowstone is such a good example of issues of gender and sort of women influencing science and what that meant for our understanding of the actual natural elements of the state. So of course that was always there, but it hadn't maybe ever been as brightly captured as it was in this particular book. And so I think it's sort of this emergence of these themes that when you think back that they were always already true. And that's, I think, one of the things I love about Aaron Saldine's book is there's suddenly a vocabulary to talk about the tension between being a townie and being a a tourist, and what that looks like. And I grew up in Polson, which is a very tourist economy, and for somebody who didn't have necessarily the vocabulary to really articulate that experience, it's this extraordinary contribution to how individuals in Montana understand themselves and their own experience. So I think that's something that's really important about that. I don't know, did you notice other tensions?
Yeah, I think a contemporary novel that kind of explores those issues too is The Widow Nash by Jamie Harrison, which just came out, and probably came out at the time we were forming this list. But it's a great companion read to Letters from Yellowstone because it's set in Livingston and involves reinvention, challenging gender roles, and plus it's just a real page turner.
That's one of the more amazing qualities of so many books that are about or written, or Montana books are page turners. There's something really phenomenal about that, and so I think that's something to remember when Desiree, when you're talking about recommending books on the reference desk, which I do too. There's a level of confidence in being able to recommend a Montana writer just because there is this craft there that is just consistent across genres, across writers, across eras, that I think is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and it's great when you can recommend a book that not only can you turn the pages, it has a plot and it has interest, but it's also beautiful. There's so much beautiful writing in this state. The landscape, landscape comes through, landscape even becomes a character, I think, and it's a character that's revered and respected, but also maybe not really trusted and a little bit feared, and I think that shines through, and that for me is something that makes a Montana book a Montana book. If people aren't interacting with or looking at or thinking about the sky and the mountains and the plains, it's not Montana enough for me personally.
Robert brought this point to bear in our meeting, which is the interchange between the literature and our conceptualization of Montana, which is, as Kim Anderson calls A.B. Guthrie's The Big Sky, is the mother book of Montana. But that we have literature to thank for our mottos, right? Big Sky Country, comes from the Big Sky, and Last Best Place comes from Kittredge. And so I'm sort of curious about this. What is this conversation? What does literature bring to bear? And then how are we commodifying or capturing it and then branding ourselves through our literature?
I don't know. This is just an attempt at approaching that sideways. Again, my ignorance. I had not read The Big Sky until about 10 years ago. And I did it because we have it's a very cool project called Montana Authors Project, which is a map online that has books that are set in Montana and places on the map and excerpts from the book, and it's a very cool thing. And so all of us got to create one, to pick a novel and create a map for that novel. And I thought, well, gosh darn it, Kim, you should read The Big Sky. And I was reluctant. And I, as difficult in many ways as that book is to read from a contemporary female standpoint, I loved it. I loved it. It was, talk about a page turner. I couldn't put it down. I was up at 3 in the morning. I've got Post-its all over it, making my map. And I mean, I was kind of simultaneously totally entranced and revolted. And so maybe not quite that strong, but and so I think, I mean, today when I see how our politicians present themselves in ads, I blame The Big Sky. I mean, who's more macho? Who's got more,
Trucks and guns.
Right, exactly. I actually think we can trace that back to that kind of a portrayal of Montana, of what Montana is.
But already in The Big Sky, the prevailing theme is it was beautiful before you got here.
It was ruined already. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. True. It's all. What's the great line he says
Yeah,
at the end?
it
It's all.
was- Yeah. Well, but I think if you come back to that, like what we want to believe about a landscape or a place, to what degree do we exist in, I don't know, something that we agree is reality and an imagined landscape? A certain degree of romanticism, I think, is necessary to negotiate life every day, and we see that on the page, and we, isn't it to set forth?
I think you're right. I think that's. I mean, of course, absolutely. But isn't it also true that? And I mean, I think Montana writers are their sentence level skill is spectacular, and how could you even begin to think about describing a landscape? And yet they do, and they often do it so well that it hits you and you think that's it, they got it right. And we've all had those moments. I have that moment every time I come up over Ravalli and I see the Mission Mountains. How could you begin to write a sentence that describes that experience? I had a colleague with me once, a visitor, and she said, how do you make it do that? And I said, do what? And she said, look like that. And I understood what she meant, that there was this speechlessness, and yet these writers overcome that consistently. I mean, even some of the books that are not my favorite on the list, A River Runs Through It has the best opening and the best closing line in literature, right? I mean, so it's pretty remarkable that there is, of course, this negotiation and this imagining, but I also think that something that really marks Montana writers is kind of a stunning ability to actually represent the landscape in a way that we can identify and that we feel probably very nostalgic toward. But also there's recognition, which means in some way that it's true, which is an important element in fiction.
Robert said the word romanticize a moment ago, and I recently learned that I have family in Montana going back to the 1860s, which that was a huge revelation for me to know that I've got 7 generations of family in Montana, and that's amazing. So now I feel like I need to go back and read The Big Sky again through that lens, because that book is about coming to the wilderness and being part of the wilderness, and I feel sort of a bit of ownership in that from my just having family here for that long. I feel like that's about me in some way. That book is about my ancestors in a way. So it's interesting how books will change for you over time, because I first read The Big Sky as a student at UM, and I don't remember a whole lot about it. But now I think I can look at it again and get way more out of it than I did as a student.
What do you think about, I think about this sometimes being from here, what do you think about trying to reconcile all sort of the vision of Montana from the people who came versus the vision of Montana from the people who were here, and what that means for us as contemporary readers, those of us who have been here for generations and those of us who just showed up from Oregon one day?
Sure.
Well, I think the best books.
Interloper.
Yeah. So, I think the best books kind of transcend that, because I remember a conversation I had with Jim Welch, and he said he wanted to write a contemporary novel. He was considering embarking on it, working on it. And, I told him, and I still think this is true, that Fool's Crow is as contemporary as any novel you'll ever read, because what do you have? The protagonist is trying to figure out how to come of age in a society that's changing and not always in best ways. He wants to do right by his family, by his community, and I don't know. We all face that, and I think if you read Fool's Crow, you're going to come away informed on how to meet some of those challenges, as you will in the Miseducation of Cameron Post, which is on the other end of the spectrum.
I do think it's a different experience reading some of the settlement stories now than it would have been 50 years ago. It's a much more uncomfortable and double-sided reading experience now than it probably was for most people then. Don't you think?
I mean, certainly that must be true. Absolutely. Which I think is a good thing.
Which is
I
a very
think,
good
I think
thing,
that
yeah.
when we, I mean, going back to thinking about how heavily my list was influenced by books that I read when I was younger, my understanding of those as I have aged has become increasingly complicated, and that's only that's always a good thing. But I do wonder about your point about transcending, or whether it's possible that it's true that, I mean, we won't talk about universal or anything like that, but can it be true that a book can transcend so well, I don't know, in order to bring together multiple storylines so that many readers could experience it and find meaning? I think that's something that's so interesting.
I want to come back to this this visual that you have, Megan. Like, I just did this like 2 weeks ago. It was like you drive up in the Missions and your heart explodes and you you might hit a truck or something. Is the literature compels image, and image is brought to film, and several of the books on the list are becoming. Perma Red is in the works. They have a Kickstarter campaign. Is that, how do we help them out? And Miseducation of Cameron Post, of course, Legends of the Fall, A River Runs Through It. Is what can we say about the relationship between film and literature in Montana, and also the tension around it, right? Like, how does it muck it up when it's filmed in Canada, or
Yeah, I think that's that's a question for the ages, right? How well any book can be translated into film, and it's probably so rare that we could think of examples where the movie really rivals the book. And of course, we could talk about just the power of imagination and the world that's created by a reader versus sort of how when you create a bounded world of a film, what shows up. But having said that, of course, there are these like iconic films that now have potentially replaced in our own memory or in our history. Montana itself, A River Runs Through It, is a great example. I think that, of course it does. Here in Missoula, it is true that you're going to see people fly fishing in the middle of the river. And so we can't scoff at that imagery too much because there's some accuracy there. But I think that's something that is very difficult. And I think that sometimes I do think it's true that sometimes when Montana films or films based on Montana books really shine, it's because they do somehow capture the landscape in a way that that transcends or connects back to the book itself. But I could think of many examples where I have not been as persuaded that the film brought life or brought meaning to the book. Can you both think of other examples where that could be true, or do we burn out on the cliche? Or once you live here, are we like, oh, A River Runs Through It, the movie?
Right. I don't know, but I would bet that one of the reasons so many Montana books and Western books in general are made into movies is because you've got this great backdrop, because of the setting, because especially in earlier days, it was a chance to show people who couldn't get to see something, this amazing landscape. So I suspect that the landscape may have overshadowed the prose and the film versions of lots of movies and with good reason. I mean, because that was one of the big motivators.
Yeah, I think that the film is rarely as good as the book, but films have artistic merit on their own, and something that they do is they bring the information to an audience that maybe wouldn't sit down with a book. We don't know any of those kind of people, of course, but I've heard they exist. I don't know, somewhere. There are people that don't read, but they still get this Montana experience, and they get this brush with literature through film versions that I think is valuable, and it casts a wider net and gets more people exposed to the fabulousness that is this place that we call home.
Yeah, I'm sure if you asked a panel of filmmakers that same question, you'd get a different answer.
Absolutely.
I would imagine that it could be quite a daunting challenge, really, to try to. I mean, so certainly if you've read the literature and then come to the place to try to be responsible for making that imagery. Gosh, I would find that very challenging if I were a filmmaker to try to capture that. And so it's pretty remarkable that we have these highly skilled filmmakers that achieve it.
I'm thinking about a couple more questions, and then audience will let you weigh in. We had this sense of like, what do we know about the secret lives of these authors? About like how they really made their money, or like how did these books come to bear? And so I don't know if you have any little tips that you would like to share, but
Nothing at all.
Persistence, I think.
like Stanley Gordon West, right? I mean, he self-published 40,000 copies. I mean, like that's part of what makes Blind Your Pony's kind of an interesting story, is that he sort of like pushed it out on his own, and voila. What else? Anything else about? Yeah, I mean Crumley. I mean,
I think when I in the 70s and 80s, when a lot of the writers that are associated with Creative Writing and with Montana Literature were, started, and the whole Livingston scene, when they started moving here, it was because, number one, it was beautiful. Number two, it was really cheap to live. And for a writer, those are, huge things. And so that was, one or two generations of Montana writers, I think that was kind of the inner life. And, my husband, who's a writer, and Kim Zupan, who's on this list, there was a construction business in Missoula that was made up of nothing but writers. And they would all work renovating people's houses until they'd saved up enough money to take 6 months off or 3 months off and go back and rewrite their novel. And that went on for years and years and years. So,
Well, I think that idea that there is that kind of community here, and I think it's kind of remarkable that you came up with a panel with 60% native Montanans, and I think I came here because of the literature and the MFA program, as did Sarah later on, and so I think books do draw people to Montana. I knew about the books before I knew about the MFA program.
I knew about Degrees of Gray in Phillipsburg before. So how do we imagine the future of Montana literature? What do we want to see? More forest fires?
no.
No, thanks. I want to continue to see the places that I recognize in Montana literature, even if Missoula has been renamed, the name of Missoula has been fictionalized in a book, you know that you're reading about Missoula. I like that. I like being able to pick up a book, and I don't care what it's called on the page. I know this spot. I've been here. And that's something that I hope continues on, that not just the connection to the landscape, but just the recognizable, identifiable grounding in place in a certain time. And I hope that's been a long tradition in our literature. I hope it continues.
I hope that we will, and I'm confident that we will have a whole new generation of books that are somehow, grounded in place in and the freedom that we have in a place where there aren't that many people, but told through a lot of different viewpoints and eyes and voices.
I think I would agree with that. I think that to me, what's particularly important is expanding the story so that it is capturing the voices of everybody, because we don't all look the same, and the richness that creates is unbelievable when we find a way for all of those narratives to come together. So I'm very hopeful that shapes, and when I think about my students at the university and some of the work that I see them do, it's coming. I have faith.
Well, I think we have to work hard to recognize the community we have here and sustain it. And the creative writing program here and the English program has been an incubator for so many of the books that we hold dear that are and aren't on this list. So I feel like maybe we became a little complacent and took that for granted as a community, and it's unique.
And we certainly shouldn't be taking it for granted right now.
Right.
Yeah. I'm impressed that so many of you are here today. I'm really grateful to see that. What questions do you have?
On that point, the incubator seems to be shrinking. And many of the authors that we've all read over the last 30 or 40 years came out of that program. Sometimes informally with humor, sometimes formally. And my sense is the university doesn't know what to teach anymore. Is that a valid statement from the outside?
Well, I don't know. I think we're still teaching creative writing, but I don't know if it's. I hope it's valued by the community, and even the motto for the program, a creative writing class may be the last place you go where your life still matters, comes from Richard Hugo, and boy, I still think that's worth teaching. I mean, and he also said, somebody asked him, can creative writing be taught? Which, to ask a teacher of creative writing, that is kind of a provocative question. But he said, I'm not sure it can be taught, but I'm certain it can be learned. And
So I have to interrupt. I forgot we're on radio. So you'll ask a question. I'll ask it into the microphone, and then we'll answer, okay? Yeah.
So this sort of picks up on your question about what would you like to see in the future, what you expect to see in the future, and also something that you had said about going back and reading, was it This House of Sky?
The Big Sky.
The Big Sky. And you had talked about how you really loved it, and yet other things made you really uncomfortable, and I took that to mean some of the classist, racist stuff. So I'm just curious if you can imagine for future writers, Montana writers, what it is, and readers, what it is in the writing now that they might find uncomfortable when they look back at these writings.
So the question is, what might students today find uncomfortable when they look back at the literature on the list?
Or what writers in the future might look at current stuff happening now and be
Right.
right. I think there's going to be some gender issues in general.
I mean, I hope that there's discomfort in the future. I hope that readers come and are persistently turning a new lens and thinking about the social and the historical and all the the economic, the racial, gender constructs, because the only way we make progress is by recognizing where we made missteps. And so I would be eager to see the kinds of things that readers would cringe at, and the missteps that they could clearly identify and find better, more hopeful, more positive ways to manage. So I hope there will be many. Yeah.
Do you think there's any danger of creating a list like this doing actual harm by eliminating people, by eliminating ideas, by categorizing things that are not scientific? Do you think that maybe the process is very valuable, but that the outcome could be harmful?
That's an amazing question. Might there be something harmful about making a list like this?
Yes.
Hopefully nobody looks at this list and thinks, this is the only good literature in Montana, because it simply is not. There's so much more out there. It's a great question, and I'm really glad you asked it. I think it'll be up to Robert and the other creative writing teachers to make sure that everybody knows about all of the other wonderful Montana literature that exists.
I'm just thinking about what are the risks? Well, the risks are missing voices. The risks are this is a popularity contest. This is the risks are that it reinforces or upholds ideas that really aren't true or need renegotiating. The risks are hurt feelings, truly.
But I think the outcome is we have a sizable group of people in here on a beautiful late September afternoon talking about books. So I think that probably is a net good.
I mean, if the goal is to sort of carry and figure out the list that you carry within yourself, and to be willing to interact with and negotiate and always have discourse with others who might have a different list, that's a pretty amazing outcome, I think. And to me, that was the real goal, because believe me, lots of my favorites did not make this list. Robert, I'll be talking with you later.
Barbara?
Well, two things came to mind. One, the observation that both the PBS Great American Read and thankfully you took up coming up with Montana Reads. Purpose is to start a discussion, and that you've done that. We're doing it. And I think in Montana we also had that same discussion when The Last Best Place came out. There were 6 editors for that. Who was there? Who was missing?
And there were then, I know of at least 4 books that were published after The Last Best Place in argument with The Last Best Place, which is terrific, which is exactly the point. And I know it might be a pain for radio, but I would love to hear from the audience shout-outs about what's not on this list that should be on this list.
I'd like to hear that too.
Mm-hmm.
What did we miss? Our list is perfect.
Yeah.
Yay, well done.
We are
Good job.
so good.
I was about to say, can I start?
We ask for information, but we crave confirmation.
Yeah, exactly.
Any just general reactions to the list?
I just have one question about, with your guys' personal connection to the MFA and just the creative writing program in general, do you think there was a bias with some of James Welch and Deborah Erling? Do you think there was any sort of bias with that, or I mean, it's a valid question.
It is.
So the question, I'm not sure if it was captured. The question is about whether there was perceived bias in the list, especially because some of us on the panel have connections to the university MFA program. absolutely there was bias. I don't think that you can create a list that doesn't in some way carry some bias. And so I love that people could identify and point out bias when they see it as a librarian. That's very important to me, that people can evaluate information. But I think that, of course, I would, make the argument that, and I love this question actually, because it's probably true that PermaRed was my number one choice. And maybe it's true that I'm biased, but I would love to have a conversation with somebody about why that's not the best book ever written in this state. So I think for me, it's the opening to a really fantastic discussion.
And I think that comes up especially with the book festival over the years. I've heard it voiced, I won't say it's a perception because I've heard people say that it's very Missoula-centric. Like we think this is the center of the literary landscape. And there are books from outside of Missoula on here, but that's been pointed out as a potential bias.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who works for a statewide agency, believe me when I tell you that I hear Missoula gets everything, a lot, a lot. So yeah, I mean, but the other side of the coin is this is the home of the state's creative writing program, and so a lot of writers have come through that program, and so it's a bias that is created. We don't have the bucking horse sale in Missoula, is what I used to say, because we don't have, they have it in Miles City, and we have a book festival because we have a creative writing program.
That's a great answer.
I was wondering about authors that you would could recommend or mention who are really dealing with some of the contemporary issues in Montana today. Since this is heavily in the past and the landscape, and I'm thinking about fracking and energy in northeast Montana, the pipeline. .com companies coming in and tech people, cost of housing, inequality, just a lot of these contemporary issues, since most of the people in the state do live in Billings, Bozeman, Missoula, Great Falls, and dealing more with some of these urban and contemporary issues. That you have some you'd like to mention.
I love this question, which is, can you recommend books that address, modern contemporary issues like fracking, real estate development, tech startups coming into town? Who are the authors that we can promote?
Brad Tyre, Opportunity Montana, that's a title, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, that deals with the misadventures of the Superfund cleanup and real on-the-ground stories about that. I think that's a great contemporary read.
Gwen Florio,
Yeah.
her new book.
Yep. Carrie LeSueur, The Home Place, set in Billings, contemporary. That's a good one.
I'm drawing a blank. Everybody's looking at me because I
Yeah, I
haven't said
know,
anything.
librarian
I'm
over
drawing-
there.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I can just hit the points that I've been hitting. Aaron Saldine's The Dead Enders,
Yeah.
Maxime Lostukov's Come West and See. Jack Clinton's book Clovis, talks about fracking. He lives in Red Lodge, and the book is sort of set in the general West, but it's all about oil. One last question?
Yes, I'd like to make a comment that I'm a little amazed sometimes at the reach of this literature. I was in Athens, Greece, and I always take pictures, postcards to give to people, and I was talking to staff in a museum in my very few words of Greek and there a few more words of English, and I showed them a picture of fly fishing. And a man looked at me and said, "River run through."
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I think that's a great way to
Yes.
Well said.
on the most nostalgic note we could possibly have. Let's go out and fly fish and support your local arts. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Sarah. Thank you.